I always say that fantasy football needs to be looked at in terms of 4 quarters. And I've been getting a lot of questions asking me, would you prefer this wide receiver or this wide receiver rest of season? So I figured it is a good time as we enter week 2 of the fantasy season to go through the rest of season wide receiver rankings. The top 30 we're going through today. But before we do, make sure to go down there, drop a like on this video, and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So going down to our first tier of guys right here, we've got Nico Collins at number 1. Listen, Nico Collins, the debate in the offseason, the great debate of who the wide receiver 1 is, that was settled very, very fast. And I had been saying all offseason, Nico Collins is the wide receiver 1. They're paying him, they just paid him new money, so he would be the wide receiver 1, and it's been unquestioned. This guy's averaging more than 10 targets per game, and as much talk as there was before the season about how much chemistry Tank Dell and CJ Stroud had, well, Nico Collins has just as much chemistry with CJ Stroud. So Nico Collins is going to continue this reign of dominance here. He's just an elite talent. People need to start recognizing that. And then Justin Jefferson here at 2. Well, the funniest thing about this one, I didn't see this one coming. I thought Justin Jefferson was in for like maybe a top 10 season, but the fact is that he's so elite, you knew he was going to be great one way or the other. Now, again, I didn't think he'd be this great, but the reality is Sam Darnold himself looks like a Pro Bowl quarterback. I mean, he's like on track to possibly win MVP. That's how good Sam Darnold has been. The only thing that concerns me is like how much does it keep up, but just based on his importance to the offense and the efficiency in which Minnesota's offense is running at, yeah, I'm comfortable having Justin Jefferson as my number 2 wide receiver rest of season. And then to round out this tier, Amon-Ra St. Brown at number 3. Amon-Ra St. Brown, the numbers don't show for it, right? Like 13.8 fantasy points per game is nothing special, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is the wide receiver 1, and he's starting to be the guy that we saw him as last year. So his target share is going to be really consistent, and Detroit's actually starting to kind of figure out their offensive identity. It's going to be like last year, where Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to handle a bunch of work, consistently hovering around 9 to 10 targets per game, and the big plays are going to come. The touchdowns are going to start to come, and they already start to come on Monday night in week 4. Amon-Ra St. Brown is going to be comfortably here at number 3. And then dropping out to our next tier right here, I've got A.J. Brown and Jamar Chase at 4 and 5. So with A.J. Brown, I actually think the Eagles played this perfectly, to be honest with you. I think the injury here, it's easy to forget when A.J. Brown, or any player for that matter, misses a bunch of time and you don't get to play them. It's easy to forget how good they were. A.J. Brown played 1 game this year and had 20.4 fantasy points in a half PPR format. A.J. Brown's the clear, unquestioned number 1. And what we saw last week is the Eagles can't move the ball without him or Devonta Smith. So it's not like he's going to lose importance to the offense all of a sudden, and he is the clear more dynamic player than Devonta Smith, who we'll get to here in a little bit. So with A.J. Brown, I think the Eagles played this perfectly. He comes back looking really good. And then Jamar Chase at 5. Again, numbers may not support this one, 14.4 fantasy points per game, but just look at the last 2 weeks and the explosion that he provides your team. This is what Jamar Chase is capable of. So the more we start to see his target share go up, and it will continue to go up because the Cincinnati Bengals, frankly, are just a better throwing team than they are a running team, Jamar Chase is going to need to be involved. Out of necessity, he's going to start to average closer to 10 targets per game. So with Jamar Chase, I'm really comfortable projecting this one out and saying that he's going to be a great asset in fantasy. Top 5 at the wide receiver position moving forward. And then rounding out this tier, CeeDee Lamb at 6 and Malik Nabers at number 7. With CeeDee Lamb and Malik Nabers, honestly interchange them if you want to. I've got no problem with it. The reason I prefer CeeDee Lamb over Nabers is because with Nabers, I do fear ultimately his quarterback's not good. Like, you can't let Malik Nabers, what he's done, fool you into thinking Daniel Jones is any good. If he misses in week 5, like, Malik Nabers is going to prove that Daniel Jones can't do anything without him. So I think that with Malik Nabers, the only thing I worry about is at some point if defenses start to be like, okay, we have to shut him down. Like, we cannot do this. But the reality is, like, I think defenses have already picked up on that, and they can't. That's why he's inside the top 10. But I still prefer CeeDee a little bit because I trust CeeDee Lamb's quarterback more. And CeeDee Lamb's going to start to average like 10 to 12 targets per game out of necessity because Really, if you take him out, there's really nobody on this offense who's going to be a legitimate threat. Dropping now to our next tier right here. Marvin Harrison Jr. at number 8. With Marvin Harrison Jr., I feel similarly to Malik Neighbors, but it's different in the sense of, like, obviously I trust his quarterback more. Now, what we'll see from Marvin is there will be games where he will have a lower floor. Like, Malik Neighbors is such a high ceiling player that they need him so desperately bad. With the Cardinals here, they have a little bit more balance offensively, so it's like James Conner's going to have big games. James Conner had a nice game in week 4 versus the Commanders. Marvin actually disappointed. He was still good, which is why he's still inside the top 10, because he's clearly the wide receiver 1. But I do think that with more balance on that offense, it's going to come with a lower ceiling, or a lower floor rather, from Marvin Harrison Jr. than it would for somebody like a Malik Neighbors. Jaden Reed, people need to understand, he's a top 10 guy. Jaden Reed's ceiling is so freaking high. And again, looking at the numbers, like targets per game is minimal. 5.5 targets per game so far. This is Deebo Samuel right here. This is Deebo Samuel's best comp. Jaden Reed takes carries, at least one a game, and he's so efficient with Jordan Love. They have a great chemistry. So we've seen 2 massive ceiling games with Jordan Love. So as long as Jordan Love can stay out there, Jaden Reed's ceiling is going to be so high. But the reason he's at 9 is because his floor is still relatively low. He will have some down weeks, but the ceiling is going to make it worth the while. And then DK Metcalf here at number 10. I think that DK Metcalf, what I've seen from him and Geno Smith this year has been eye-opening. Like, I have not seen this level of consistency with DK Metcalf's targets since, like, close to his rookie year. So it's been really encouraging to watch because I didn't expect it at all. And DK is he's such a spectacular talent. I've never questioned that. I question Geno Smith as a quarterback and their offensive situation as a whole. With Ryan Grubb, this offense is very consistently leaning on DK Metcalf. He should have had a better week in week 4. He's going to continue to have spike weeks and really a pretty stable floor to go along with it. Now, dropping out to our next tier right here. I've got Rashee Rice at 11. It comes with a major caveat. Can the dude return? Now, a couple days ago, like, us as a whole, we were like preparing for a funeral, basically. Like, we thought he was not going to come back. I'm so cautiously optimistic. Like, I want to be optimistic about the reports that, you know, maybe he didn't end up getting an injury for the rest of the season. Maybe it's just a hyperextension. I'm ranking him here because if he does return, he's still a top 12 guy. But obviously, he's going to miss time either way. Like, there's no way that he comes back sooner than like 3 or 4 weeks. Rashee Rice is going to miss a month. So you can't realistically rank him in the next couple tiers above him because he's going to miss time and miss out on fantasy points. But when he does return, Rashee Rice will ultimately go back to being as important as he was. So again, major caveat here. We need to see the guy return, and we don't know what the situation is. By the time you're watching this, maybe he was ruled out. And so if he is ruled out, you can just take him out, obviously. Mike Evans at 12 and Deebo Samuel at 13. With Mike Evans here, the only thing that really concerns me with him too is that he's in his 30s and he's been injured the last several weeks. And ultimately, I don't know like how he's going to hold up for a full season. But obviously, his ceiling is so high that he's going to hit those big ceiling games. It's very much like DK, though. Like, actually, his floor is closer to like Jaden Reed's, where it's actually relatively low because they do have a good number 2 option with Chris Godwin. So Mike Evans is still going to have great games for you. The ceiling games are going to be there. I just called him a buy low trade target a couple weeks back, and I am totally on board with it because I still think he's a top 12 guy. And then at 13 with Deebo Samuel, listen, Deebo Samuel is going to hit big games, and the concern that I have is obviously the floor aspect. And he's an older player who's already dealt with an injury as well. So with that injury, like, does it come back at some point? Like, Deebo's kind of almost a guarantee, unfortunately, to miss a couple games in a year. So that keeps his ceiling capped as far as where his finish will be. And then to round out the tier, Tyreek Hill and Chris Godwin at 14 and 15. Tyreek Hill, it's hard to rank him too because obviously Tyreek's talent is ridiculously great, but the Miami Dolphins without Tua are incapable. I mean, they're incompetent at playing football. So they desperately need Tua to give Tyreek Hill any sort of upside here. Now, with Tua, I researched and I read that his target return date is looking like it's going to be week 8. So again, the next several weeks, we're going to be in purgatory with Tyreek Hill. It's going to be bad performances here. But with Tyreek Hill, obviously when Tua returns, we need to see that happen. Because until then, it's not going to be great in fantasy. That bumps him down here. And then Godwin at 15. Might feel a little low for some. That's okay. I can understand if you do want to rank him above Tyreek Hill or maybe even Deebo Samuel. I think that Chris Godwin here, there's going to be weeks where he doesn't get in the end zone, like last week, and it will disappoint you, right? Like, he had 9 targets in week 4, but he still didn't put that great of a fantasy effort forward because he doesn't get a bunch of downfield targets. He's not Mike Evans. He's more of a possession receiver and getting a lot of shorter throws, similar to like a Jackson Smith and Jigba in a little bit of ways. So with Godwin, there will be weeks where he just disappoints you, but ultimately his floor just based on targets is really high, and based on the way that Baker's playing, his ceiling is really high, and I'm actually really excited to see what happens in this week 5 matchup versus Atlanta. And I'll tell you what else I'm excited about hitting. Kirk Cousins hitting more than half a yard. That's obviously going to win me free money this week on Underdog. And if you haven't taken advantage of it yet, go down in the comments and grab that link. And when you use code FFN to sign up for Underdog and deposit at least $10, they'll match that first deposit 50% up to $1,000 in bonus cash. And you will be able to take advantage of this Kirk Cousins free line right here on Underdog. Now, jumping down to our next tier, we've got Devonta Smith at 16 and Garrett Wilson at number 17. Devonta Smith really is the best number 2, probably outside of like Chris Godwin in the league. Like, that's kind of how I feel in fantasy football terms, because with Devonta Smith, like, we only have one game to go off of with Kellen Moore's system and AJ Brown, and he did really well. And he obviously did really well as a wide receiver 1 for the team. So with Devonta Smith, again, it's easy to forget since he didn't play last week and the Eagles looked like hot garbage without their top 2 receivers. It's easy to forget how good these guys are. But when they're both on the field together, Devonta Smith's ceiling is really high. Now, again, you're going to have some bad games from Devonta Smith. He won't always get you big games. Sometimes he will get you like 7, 6, 5-point games. But Devonta Smith's ceiling is really high, and the offense will be consistent when the both of them are back. So I do feel good about having him here at 16. And then with Garrett Wilson at 17, you know, it's tough because I really like Garrett Wilson. I think he's a good buy low right now. But with Garrett Wilson, one thing that we definitely got proven is that he's not an elite guy. Like, we were kind of hoping like he'd jump into like Justin Jefferson territory, or maybe somebody like Malik Neighbors this year, for example. And the reality is he's just not that guy. Like, he got shut down by Pat Surtain, as most of them have. Even elite guys have. But Garrett Wilson, outside of that game, like, he's done basically the same thing. So, it's Garrett Wilson. I believe that he will hit a big game at some point. He will have a better quarter coming up here in the fantasy season because he just needs to get in the end zone. And Garrett Wilson, I do ultimately still believe in as a player. So I've got him above Stephon Diggs here at 18, who I believe has separated himself. I don't think anybody disagrees. He's separated himself, and he's the wide receiver 2 in Houston. And his role is very sustainable. Like, they're targeting him at the very short distance routes. He's getting high percentage throws closer to the line of scrimmage. He's getting those short, 3rd and short opportunities. He's getting those goal line opportunities as well. He's even getting rushes for them. Like, the good thing about Stephon Diggs is that CJ Stroud is so good, and he's got room for 2 great wide receivers in fantasy. Stephon Diggs, I ultimately worry a little bit like Tank Dell will come in and play better, because I ultimately believed before the season that Diggs would be the 3 and Tank Dell would be the 2. Obviously, we just haven't seen it yet, and I do think this role is very sustainable for Diggs, so I've got him here at 18. And then rounding out the tier at 19 and 20, Davante Adams and Deontay Johnson, they're almost the same, but in different ways. Like, these 2 guys are massive question marks for 2 different reasons. Davante Adams, obviously, we're in the midst of trade conversation. Like, I don't think that he's playing another game for the Raiders here. And I do see that the Raiders are looking to trade him right now. So by the time you're watching this, maybe he's already dealt somewhere. I read his top options that he wants to go to is either going with Aaron Rodgers or going with Derek Carr. He wants to play with familiarity at quarterback. Also read the Steelers are interested. Listen, the reality with Davante Adams is if he doesn't get traded within the next like 2 or 3 weeks, he's going to miss out on an upside. And even if he goes to New York, you know, what's the upside realistically with Aaron Rodgers? 40 years old, doesn't look his best, and Aaron Rodgers is getting put under duress right now. I think Devontae's still a great player. It's just kind of hard to read this one right now. So obviously, him being the player he is, it's going to keep him inside the top 20. But depending on where he goes, that's going to really ultimately determine where I feel comfortable ranking him in rest of season rankings. And then with Deontay Johnson, totally different reason. I think this, if they stick with Andy Dalton the entire season, Deontay Johnson should be like a top 15 guy. Like, that's the amount of targets that he gets on a consistent basis. And the chemistry he's built in a short period of time with Andy Dalton has been awesome. So I think that Deontay Johnson, if Andy Dalton's the guy, all year is top 15. I don't know if it's going to be, though. Like, Bryce Young, I would not be surprised realistically if they end up putting him back in. And that definitely lowers his ceiling, as we saw in the first 2 weeks. So with Deontay Johnson, tread lightly on this one. He's someone I have a hard time committing to because of the quarterback uncertainties. And then dropping out to our next tier right here, I've got Drake London at 21 and Terry McLaurin at number 22. I feel good about that one. Drake London, here's the reality with him. His target baseline is actually increasing, and I think it's going to be sustainable. Like, Drake London is in a similar situation to Garrett Wilson a little bit. Some may prefer London over him. I think that's okay. It's a personal difference for me. I believe ultimately that Garrett Wilson's a better player, and we'll see better games from him in the next several weeks. I just think that Drake London is overhyped for the most part, and just realistically, Darnell Mooney is a threat in that offense. And Kirk Cousins just doesn't look like the quarterback he did with Minnesota, where he could support 2 wide receivers in that offense. So I just think that Drake London's ceiling is a little bit lower. They're going to keep designing him routes, and it's going to keep his target share really consistent. But Drake London ultimately I don't have a huge level of confidence in his ceiling. And then Terry McLaurin at 22. I think that Terry McLaurin, it's also a little bit scary for me to rank him because I think that when you go based on the past 2 weeks, Terry McLaurin could be like in the 15 range, right? Like, he's getting the targets. He's obviously a big play guy, and Jaden Daniels looks amazing. I'm terrified, though, for 2 reasons. You go back to those first 2 weeks, Terry McLaurin, people were asking me if they could drop him. Like, he was that bad in fantasy football. And mind you, Jaden Daniels wasn't playing bad then either. Now, Jaden Daniels is the other reason I'm scared. His level of efficiency that he's seeing right now is so historically unsustainable throughout the history of the NFL. I'm like, when does it end? When does he take a downturn? It's going to happen, and what happens to Terry McLaurin when it happens? So I think that if you're trying to buy Terry McLaurin, wait a little bit. I think he's going to be a top 25 guy for the rest of the season. I just worry about what the turn looks like whenever Jaden Daniels starts to struggle a little bit more. 23 and 24, Jameson Williams and Jalen Waddle. Jameson Williams, I prefer him over Jalen Waddle because he's just got a more sustainable situation offensively. Like, Jalen Waddle with Tua is going to see a more consistent target share than Jameson Williams. But Jameson Williams in Detroit, he fits exactly the role they want him to fit. There will be times where he gets you 8 to 9 targets, and there's going to be times like on Monday night where he just has like a couple targets, but he hits an 80-yard house call. So like Jameson Williams, his role is set in a really stable, high-potency offense, and Jalen Waddle, very similar to Tyreek, is completely dependent on Tua. So with Jalen Waddle, he's going to miss out on several more games without Tua, so it just lowers his ceiling ultimately. And then Chris Olave to round out the tier at 25. Chris Olave, ultimately his ceiling just isn't that high. Like, and the worst part about it is actually he's losing targets in this offense. That's the biggest problem I have with him, is he's actually starting to lose targets on a per game basis compared to last year. And I guess it's sort of evened out because Clint Kubiak has come in and made Derek Carr more efficient and made his playmakers more efficient, which keeps him inside the top 25 because he's the wide receiver 1. But the problem is that if he loses targets, he's not really been an end zone guy his entire career. So I struggle to see a ton of upside with Chris Olave at this point. And then dropping out to our last tier, Zay Flowers at 26 and Brian Thomas Jr. at 27. I know that Zay Flowers has kind of been a big topic of conversation over the last several days after week 4. He's had a bad stretch. And here's the problem, like, I got flack for ranking him lower in the offseason. People were like, oh, it's a second-year wide receiver. He's going to take the leap. Lamar's such a great quarterback. And it's like, listen, Lamar is a very great player. But there's a difference between being a great thrower of the football and being a great athlete. I'm not saying Lamar can't throw the ball. What I am saying is that just look at the history with Lamar's fantasy receivers. They don't have much upside. Why? Because he doesn't push the ball down the field that much. There's a reason why Lamar Jackson doesn't have 4,000-yard passing seasons. It's because he can't. He's had plenty of years to do it, he can't. So that lowers Zay Flowers' upside. Tons of his targets, most of them, are at or near the line of scrimmage. So that lowers his floor. But it also, his targets that he gets on a per game basis keeps his floor relatively stable. And we do know that he can hit big weeks. They're just more few and far between than somebody like a Mike Evans or even somebody like a Jameson Williams at this point, I think. So with Zay Flowers, just kind of recalibrate your expectations. He's going to be fine, and I think he's a really good wide receiver 3 option at this point. And then Brian Thomas Jr., you know, the crazy thing about it is, like, if his situation was more stable, he'd be closer to 20 than he is to 30. But I think this Jags team is on the verge of disaster. As of the time you're watching this, they're 0-4, and Brian Thomas Jr. is the best of the bunch easily, and he's the preferred target at this point. Like, he's the wide receiver 1. But the problem with it is that I think this team, they may fire Doug Peterson here soon, and Trevor Lawrence just doesn't look that great. So, like, there's potential for disaster. It reminds me of Deontay Johnson, where I want to believe in the player and believe in the upside that he has in fantasy, and I think for the time being he does. But I ultimately do worry about the instability of the team, which could definitely affect his fantasy value moving forward. 28, I've got DJ Moore here. I think DJ Moore is a high upside guy, and I think that he is a good buy low in a lot of circumstances, but ultimately, like, the way that Caleb looks right now, there's just no chemistry being built. And I think that Caleb's looking better throughout the weeks, but DJ Moore is just he's not vibing with Caleb right now. So it's hard for me to see, like, a major resurgence and it just kind of clicks all of a sudden, but it happens all the time. So with DJ Moore, the one thing that we can count on is he's going to continue to get pushed the ball because he is their wide receiver 1. So he's going to continue to get the push. At some point, I just hope that him and Caleb can start to build that connection. And then rounding it out, T. Higgins at 29 and Jordan Addison at 30. My 2 wide receiver 2s, I think, are going to have great weeks moving forward. T. Higgins, it hasn't happened yet. But the problem is that he just hasn't, like, it just hasn't worked out. It's not because he's not getting opportunities. He's gotten end zone opportunities since he's been back. It's going to come at some point. He's on a contract year. You know the dude wants to perform. So as long as they continue to feed him opportunities, he's going to have good weeks. And then with Jordan Addison, I'm at the point where I just think the Vikings can easily sustain 2 wide receivers in fantasy football. I didn't think that at the beginning of the year. I think that now. Jordan Addison came back with a vengeance in week 4, and I think that there's more weeks like that ahead for Jordan Addison. His ceiling, his floor won't be as consistent, but his ceiling will be consistently that high and probably even higher. So let me know what your team record is right now, and if you want to see the top 30 wide receivers for week 5 fantasy football, click on this video right here.